I must repeat what he has reminded you, because you need to fill out a form so you can get the grants. Okay, so thank you for being here today, ladies and gentlemen. And again, I must repeat what the minister said this morning. My presentation is not the keynote presentation, it's only a preamble, you know. My panelists are distinguished guests with a lot of wisdoms. They are presidents, AC chair, and treasurers of many charities for many years, so they have a lot of wisdom to share. So make sure they have slip for writing the questions. Yeah, so you can actually start writing up your questions and pass it up to us. Okay, so basically my presentation just to set the stage and the context of the discussions. Why is audit committee important to charities? In fact, I was talking to I would say a very senior person who used to be a regulator for corporate governance, and about how people who are independent directors of listed company confuses the role of a independent director on a listed company versus that of a charity. There's some nuances, some differences. So some of the people who are used to sit on board of listed companies don't understand it, and they try to apply the same scope of work to a charity, and of course it didn't quite work because the structures are a little different. Okay, so if you look at the audit committees, the requirement in the quote, if you look at the chart here, if you are an IPC, obviously you need to have an audit committee, right? Because if you're an IPC, you start off as an intermediate, as it is. And if you are not an IPC, again, the requirement for audit committee starts quite early. If your revenue or expenditure is more than 50,000, you already are required to have an audit committee, right? So what is the guidance that we have at the moment in the quote and the charity quote in terms of audit committee for charities? One is the terms of reference, right? I think this, you may think this is quite simple, straightforward, just cut and paste from somewhere, but it's more than that. It's complicated by the fact that in a charity, you have the audit committee is actually not in the constitutions, unlike the finance committee or the treasury, the treasurer's role, and it's also not in the Charities Act, unlike in a listed company where the audit committee is actually defined in the Companies Act, and also in many charities, the audit committee also often double up as a risk committee. So you have an audit and risk committee, and therefore that terms of reference need to accommodate that additional requirement as well, right? And the other guideline in the quote talks about the chairman of the AC should preferably have a recognized accounting qualifications or appropriate practical experience. So that talks about the experience of the audit committee chairman. So far, there's talk about terms of reference, what is the duty of the audit committee, and second, what is the qualification of the audit committee chairman. And the third area is who can you bring into the audit committee? I think this is often one of the questions that were raised by charity as well. I only have a small board. I don't have too many accountants. How do I form a audit committee, right? So the guideline here is that only the chairman of the audit committee need to be a main board member. You can actually co-opt the other accountants or other members from the professions, from people who may be already in other charities, to sit on your audit committee, right? So this is number 3 guidelines on composition of the audit committee. And the fourth one, which I think is also very important, is who should not be chairing the audit committee, or maybe you can extend it further in the discussion later on, who should not be in the audit committee, right? The guideline says that the treasurer or the finance committee chair should not concurrently chair the AC. So we will have a discussion on that in the panel. Why not, and why yes? Maybe some of you wants to say yes. I hear arguments both sides. Okay, so here you are. There are 4 questions we looked at when we formed audit committee. One is, like I said, what is the duty? Second, what's the experience of the audit committee chairman or member? And number 3, what are the compositions of the audit committee? And number 4, who should not be on the audit committee, right? So let's look at across the major jurisdictions, what regulations do they have? We looked at, we compare Singapore to Hong Kong, to the UK, Australia, and the US. So in terms of the duties and authority of the audit committee, Hong Kong is similar to us. You need to have terms of reference. The UK, it says terms of reference are reviewed regularly, so it implies you need to have a terms of reference. And Australia also talked about having a committee charter that sets the behaviors and the duties. So that is similar to us. Only the US, obviously US want to be different all the time, right? There is no specific mention in the US quote on what is the role of the audit committee. And when it comes to qualification and experience of audit committee chair or members, Hong Kong actually is a bit more specific, right? It says at least one independent NED chairman with appropriate professional qualification and accounting-related financial management expertise. So that's similar to us, except it doesn't necessarily be the chairman, right? In Singapore, you said the chairman of audit committee should have accounting experience. In Hong Kong, they give you a bit more flexibility. As long as one of the independent AC member is an accountant, that should be okay. In the UK, it says AC chair should have recent financial experience. Financial experience can be quite broad, right? Can be a banker. So it doesn't talk about specifically accounting qualifications. Australia, there is no specific mention. And US, it does say that AC composes of independent board members with appropriate, again, it says financial experience. So the focus is not on accounting. Okay, so I think actually we and Hong Kong are better in terms of defining the qualification of audit committee chairman and members. In terms of compositions and independence, now in Singapore we say that besides the chairman, other AC member need not to be board member of the main board, so it gives you flexibility to recruit or co-op from outside. Whereas in Hong Kong, it's quite clear it comprises of NEDs, separate from and independent from management. So it's quite clear that it actually gives you better guidance than the Singapore court, right? The audit committee member need to be independent from management, okay, and comprising only of NEDs, right? Because the quote in Singapore, as it is, it actually allows management even to be an AC member, because there's no exclusion clause, right? And Hong Kong actually has an exclusion clause in there. And the UK talks about audit committee member need to be refreshed. I think which is what Furman was talking about this morning, that perhaps audit committee member ought to have a shorter tenure than the 10-year rule for other board members. I see some of my clients practice that 6 years, like what Furman was saying this morning. The Australia doesn't have any guidance on that, and in the US, it does talks about AC composes of independent board members, but then it's a bit contradictory when you look at the next one. In the US, it says the board may choose not to have an AC. So it's a bit of a contradictory provisions in the US. Oh, sorry. Well, let me go back to press the wrong button. Okay. Right. And the US does talk about having non-voting advisors to advise the audit committee or board on audit matters. Now, the last one, which I think is very important for today's discussion, is who should not be on the audit committee to avoid conflicting duties. In Singapore, we say that the treasurer and the finance committee chair should not concurrently chair the audit committee. I hope that later on you'll bring up more questions so we can have a lively discussion on that. In Hong Kong, it's extended to the board chairman. Okay, the board chairman should not chair the audit committee. This is similar to, in fact, our Singapore SGX listing rule, where the chairman of the board should not chair the audit committee. There is obviously a good reason for that. In the UK, no specific provision. In Australia, also no specific provisions. But like I say, in the US, there is provision that the board may choose not to have an audit committee and have the audit matter to be handled by the whole board, so which is a bit funny. Okay, so so much is the comparison across the major jurisdictions. Now, I am not going to go into the rest of the slides in terms of why A0 and F0, because I want that to come through from the panel discussions and from your questioning. And some of the challenges I hear talking to charities in forming an effective audit committee, the first one is that when you try to establish an audit committee in some charities, because the requirement of charity is not in the Charities Act, or it's not in the Constitution, so to say, the particular charity's constitutions, there is resistance when you try to establish an audit committee for charities, because in the constitution of most charities, you'll find the office bearers are defined. Key office bearers are defined, right? President, vice president, treasurer, and secretary, and all that. So there is no position identified as an audit committee chair, isn't it? Because audit committee is a new governance concept that just came in about maybe less than 10 years ago. In the past, for most non-profit organizations, financially the gatekeeper is always the treasurer, isn't it? Who make sure that the financial policy and process and everything are in place. So with the initiative to form audit committee, you'll get some resistance from some of the treasurers. I'm not saying all, to say that, why I'm supposed to be in charge of finance, why do you need to have somebody to check on me? So there's a bit of a resistance there. And another reason which I find is quite valid, especially for smaller charities, because they have trouble as it is recruiting enough accountants on a board. So if they only have one accountant on board, one is the treasurer or the chairman of the finance committee, how do they find another person who can chair the audit committee, right? But the code actually provided for that. You can actually co-opt other accountants to be a member of the audit committee. And the other reason why I think audit committee in charity is not effective is a resource that charity can spend in engaging internal auditors, because as you know, internal auditors are basically the arms and the legs of audit committee, right? Otherwise, who is going to be there to do the work and review the processes for the audit committee? It has to be relying on the internal auditors. So there's always a struggle in terms of how much resource you spend on governance and how much of the resource should go to the beneficiaries. So it has to be a trade-off. Okay, so if you look at an example here, of course I must put a caveat that this is case is only if it is similar to any organization, it's only coincidental, right? If you look at this particular charity, who I shall not name the names, you looked at that and you say, well, okay, how can you have an audit committee where 3 out of 5 are actually paid staff, right? And the treasurer is also an AC member, but it complies with the code as it is. The code as it is, you only need to have audit committee. Yeah. So it's a problem. So before we go into the panel discussion, I just want to express my view that in summary of my presentation, I think to have an effective audit committee, you need to look at the 4 pillars. Okay, I define pillars so it's easy to remember. The first pillar on the right will be independence. The audit committee need to be independent. Not only independent from the management, because in a charity context, management is a bit gray, right? It's committee members, management, because some of the charities, especially sports organizations, call their board management committee, right? Some call it board, some call it council, and some call it governance committee and all that, but quite a number of charities actually call their board management committee, and especially people who are treasurers, presidents, and programs committee and all that, they actually make executive decisions, right? So independent from management, not just from paid staff. Actually, I think it needs to be independent from functional committee as well to avoid the conflicting role. And of course, the second one in the purple is, on the right bottom, is qualifications of audit committee or members. And the third is pillar, I feel it need to have a strong internal audit support, okay, to make sure that there's somebody there to review the internal control process and risk management. If you're taking pictures, you need to tell me you're taking me or taking the slides. If you are taking the slide will be posted by CS later on. Yeah. If you are taking my picture, I need to comb my hair. Okay, and of course the last one I feel important, which is similar to what Fermin is saying this morning. You need to make sure that your audit committee don't overstay, because you need to maintain the independence. You cannot have an audit committee member who's been there for the last 20 years, right? Preferably should be shorter than the 10 years. So you need to build in some succession planning to your audit committee members, and of course to your main board as well. Oh, sorry. Okay. So without further ado, let me call on our panelists so we can have we can share their wisdoms. As I mentioned, they are very experienced as presidents and treasurers and audit committee chairmen and members of charities.